World War I, also known as the First World War, was a global war centered in Europe. The war lasted for 4 years, 3 months and 2 weeks. It began on July the 28th and lasted until November the 11th, 1918. Before World War II began in 1938, World War I was called the Great War, the war to end all wars, or the World War. 135 countries took part and more than 17 million people died. It involved nearly all the biggest powers of the world, separated by 2 alliances, the Allies, Russia, France, British Empire, Italy, United States, Romania, Japan, Belgium, Serbia, Greece, Portugal and Montenegro, and the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria and Turkey. The war was fought on every ocean and nearly every continent. Still, most of the fighting took place in Europe. Since we, as Europeans, are the ones that wrote history, even though most of the Asian world is missing from the war, we said 2/3 of the world being engaged in a war is close enough to be called World War. The war didn't just start overnight. There was some build-up. In 1914, Europe was divided between 2 major alliance systems, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. The Triple Alliance was Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. However, Italy left, so it became the Dual Alliance, and the Triple Entente consisted of Great Britain, Russia and France. A second step towards war was made decades before. There was an arms race between Germany and Great Britain, a naval arms race that Britain won in 1914. It had 38 dreadnoughts and dreadnought battle cruisers to Germany's 24. The army size was quite different before the war. Russia and France together had 1 million more troops than Germany and Austria-Hungary combined, and if you were to include Britain's peacetime force of 250,000 people, the Triple Entente had more manpower than the Dual Alliance. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 set Serbia on the stage as an empowered nationalistic state. It has Slavic intention, and those intentions ran counter to Austria-Hungary's imperial ambitions. Any conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would mean also conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia, or at least threatened involvement, because Russians had a sympathy to Serbia and its nationalism. Reasons of the Great War are many, deep, complicated. There isn't just one. You couldn't even name a list of causes. Still, there was a chain of events that directly led to the fighting. To this day, the root causes are a continued debate and discussion. The list is just an overview. I'm going to name popular reasons cited for the emergence of World War I. Mutual defense alliances. Over time, countries throughout Europe made mutual defense agreements that would pull them into battle. These treaties meant that if one country was attacked, allied countries were bound to defend them. Before World War I, the following alliances existed: Russia and Serbia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, France and Russia, Britain, France and Belgium, Japan and Britain. So, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia got involved to defend Serbia, Germany, seeing Russia mobilizing, declared war on Russia. France was then drawn in against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany attacked France through Belgium, pulling Britain into war. Then Japan entered the war. Later, Italy and the United States would enter on the side of the Allies. A second reason would be empire building. Imperialism is when a country increases their power and wealth by bringing additional territories under their control. Before World War I, Africa and parts of Asia were points of contention among the European countries. This is true because of the riches these areas could provide. Increasing competition and desire for greater empires led to an increase in confrontation that helped push the world into the Great War. Nationalism. Much of the origin of the war was based on the desire of the Slavic people of Bosnia and Herzegovina to no longer be part of Austria-Hungary, but instead be part of Serbia. In this way, nationalism led directly to war, but in a more general way. Nationalism was present in all European countries. It helped not only the beginning, but the extension of the war in Europe. Each country trying to prove their dominance, power, imposing their way of life as the right way of life, and the supremacy of a single country all over Europe, if not the world. Militarism. As the world entered the 20th century and the arms race began, by 1914 Germany had the greatest increase in military buildup. Great Britain and Germany both greatly increased their navies in this time. Further, in Germany and Russia, the military establishment began to have a greater influence on the public policy. This increase in militarism helped push the countries involved into war. Countries were building their military forces, arms, training people, and building battleships. Countries either wanted to regain lost territories or to expand their empire. Fifth reason, the Bosnian crisis. Austria-Hungary took over the Turkish province of Bosnia in 1909, angry in Serbia. Next, in 1911, we have the Moroccan crisis, when, get this, not the French but the Germans were protesting against the French people for occupying their Morocco. And finally, the seventh reason, the immediate assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his pregnant wife Sophie in Sarajevo while on a visit. The immediate cause of the World War I that made the aforementioned items come into play, alliances, militarism, imperialism, nationalism, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In 1914, a Serbian nationalist terrorist group called the Black Hand sent groups to assassinate the Archduke. The group was Serbian, it wasn't backed by the Serbian government, it wasn't stopped either, they just turned a blind eye. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in Serbia to try lessen the tensions between the countries, and he got involved in an assassination attempt. The first attempt failed when the driver avoided a grenade thrown at their car. However, later that day, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated him and his pregnant wife while in Sarajevo, Bosnia, part of Austria-Hungary. This was in protest to Austria-Hungary having control of this region, Serbia wanting to take over Bosnia and Herzegovina. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph and the heir to the throne of Austria and Hungary. He was assassinated on a Sunday, on 28th of June 1914, around 11 a.m. in the morning. The assassination precipitated the July crisis. The July crisis was a month of negotiations, ultimatums between countries, shameful ones that couldn't be accepted, and the first war declaration was between Austria-Hungary and Serbia on 28th of July 1914. This after Germany signed a blank check to Austria-Hungary saying that it will get 199% involved in the war, which it did. And so it begins. The declaration caused a domino effect in the alliance system, each declaration causing another declaration of war. Russia mobilized her army. This just to be safe thing was seen by the Germans as declaration of war, so it declared war. The German war plan was called the Schleifen Plan and required Germany to defeat France in just 6 weeks to avoid a two-front war, which it failed to do because the plan itself was flawed. The plan hinged on 8 invisible virtual divisions. They did not exist, and later it was outmaneuvered at the Battle of Marne, which kind of sealed the end of the war for Germany. 3/4 of the British government were for absolute non-interference at any price, and according to the Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, Britain was not required by any treaty to support France or Russia in the event of war with Germany, and many British politicians were against intervention. Still, Britain declared war on Germany on August the 4th, after Germany invaded Belgium. It was obliged to do that by the Treaty of London of 1838. On the 1st of November 1914, the Ottoman Empire, which still existed, declared war on the German alliance side. Russia, followed soon by France, and Britain was compelled to declare war on the Ottoman Empire when it joined the Central Powers in August, signing the Turkish-German alliance. Mobilization and recruitment. On 30th of July 1914, Tsar Nicholas II agreed to a full mobilization of the Russian army. This was seen as the declaration of war, and Germany declared war on Russia on the 1st of August. Still, Russia was able to call for the largest army in its first day, 5 million people. Germany was second, 4.5 million people, followed by France with 3.7 million people. Britain only had an army of 733,000 men, but in 1918 the war count stood at 3,002,000 people. And this is in part to Lord Kitchener's ad campaign. He saw that the British army was far too small compared to the French or German forces and wanted to build a 7 divisions army. He called for 200,000 men to sign up for the British army in the first month of war, and more than 300,000 men enlisted. They were kids. War represented an adventure for the new recruits. The ad campaign and general consensus was that we'll be home by Christmas, less than half a year. Finally, more men joined the army by their own free will than after the introduction of conscription in 1916. Around 2.5 million people volunteered, approximately a quarter of the total British eligible men. Almost a million British men appealed against their conscription in the first 6 months. Most were granted exemption of some sort, even if it was only temporary. Often white feather was given to those who refused to fight out of principle alone. Still, Britain, on paper, could have had such a big army that it would be absolutely impossible for someone to win against them. It was the British Empire. It had over 400 million people that it could have called out to war. In India alone, it had 300 million people. A quarter of that 400 million would have meant 100 million men joining the war. Germany finally sent to war 13 million people. Comparing that to 100 million people, it would have been a landslide. So the war was lost the second Germany poked the British bear. By December 1915, around 30% of Scottish men aged 15 to 49 had volunteered. In the end, over a quarter of all Scots who enlisted became casualties. In 1917, the conditions got so dire that the Russian government opened battalions of death, troops made entirely by women. The role was shaming men that they were not going to war or shaming them into fighting harder. These battalions rarely saw the battleground. In total, during the war, 13.4 million Germans went to war, and it's written in history as the biggest amount of people sent by any country involved in the war. Finally, in 1917, USA joins the war, reluctantly. It needed 5 reasons to get moving. And we know finally that the United States played a crucial role in the following peace treaty. Still, the country tried to remain neutral throughout most of the conflict, which it regarded as a European war. By 1917, Woodrow Wilson, which campaigned against war policy, elect me and I won't send you to war, changed his mind along with public opinion in favor of the US entry into war for the following 5 reasons, how I said earlier. First, German atrocities in Belgium. One factor that had a huge influence over the American public opinion was the word of mouth or news regarding the atrocity Germany made when they entered peaceful Belgium. Stories of unarmed civilians being killed and small towns being destroyed circulated throughout the press. Although some or most of these stories were British propaganda, untrue, they left a strong anti-German feeling among Americans. The next and stronger reason, economic interest. The American businessmen were very interested in the Allied victory, and many such as JP Morgan helped fund the British and French with approximately $3 billion in 100 years ago dollars in loans and bond purchases. If the Allies would be defeated by the Central Powers, they would have had no reason to repay those $3 billion. The people you backed lost, so there's nobody to pay you back. They wouldn't be able to repay their debt to the US. Many businessmen therefore supported the so-called preparedness movement, which campaigned for the US intervention in the war on the side of Allied forces. Third reason, sinking of Lusitania. In May 1915, a German submarine, a U-boat, sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, which had weapons on board, but also had 1,000 people, 128 of those being American. The general practice when a situation like this would have occurred was, hey, we are the Germans, we caught you, we see you have weapons, give them to us, and go on your merry way. They didn't do that. They just sunk the battleship. The sinking further increased anti-German sentiment in America. Next one, we have unrestricted submarine warfare. In response to the British blockade, which meant disruption of the infrastructure, weapon supply, food supply, any kind of supply, the Germans started their own type of blockade on the sea. After the sinking of Lusitania, Germany promised to stop unrestricted submarine warfare, but within less than 1 year, they torpedoed another passenger ship, the cross-English Channel ferry Sussex. Again, the Germans promised not to attack passenger ships without warning. They signed the Sussex Pledge, but the pledge was short-lived as well. Fifth and final reason, the Zimmermann telegraph. In 1917, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram to Mexico suggesting that if the US should declare war on Germany, Mexico should declare war on the US in return. Mexico would get back the territory lost in the Mexican-American War, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Unfortunately for Germany, the telegram was intercepted by the British intelligence and happily given to the Americans. Although Mexico had no intention of declaring war to the USA, the publication of the letter further mobilized the American people against the Central Powers, and having 5 big reasons to start, and the people behind you, they declared war. War was full of life in the first month since it began. It had 2 fronts, Western and Eastern. It consisted of bold attacks and rapid troop movements on both fronts. In the West, Germany attacked first Belgium and then France. In the East, Russia attacked both Germany and Austria-Hungary. In the South, Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, but following the Battle of Marne, 5 to 9 September 1914, the Western Front became entrenched in central France and remained that way for the rest of the war. The rest of the fronts in the east also gradually locked into place. Late in 1940, the Ottoman Empire was brought into the fray as well, after Germany tricked Russia into thinking that Turkey had attacked it. As a result, much of the 1950s was dominated by Allied action against the Ottomans. First, Britain and France launched a failed attack on the Dardanelles. This campaign was followed by the British invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Britain also launched a separate campaign against the Turks in Mesopotamia. Although the British had some success there, the Gallipoli campaign and the attacks on the Dardanelles resulted in British defeats. Trench warfare. The middle part of the war, 1916 and 1917, was dominated by trench warfare. Trench warfare began in 1914, but the war tactic didn't dominate the war until 1916. Both sides had built a series of trenches that went from the North Sea and through France and Belgium. Soldiers fought from digging positions, striking at each other with machine guns, heavy artillery, and chemical weapons. The land between the 2 enemy trench lines was called no man's land. This land was sometimes covered with barbed wire, landmines, and scared cats. The enemy trenches were generally around 50 to 250 yards apart. Those soldiers died by the millions in brutal conditions. Neither side had any meaningful success or gained any advantage from trench warfare. US enters, Russia exits. Despite the stalemate on both fronts in Europe, 2 important developments in the war happened in early April 1917, provoked by the German attacks. The US entered, despite popular opinion until the provocation, entered the war. The country was angered by attacks upon its ships in the Atlantic, declared war on Germany. Then in November, the Bolshevik Revolution ended. There was no more Tsar, no more alliances, the old government was gone, so there were no reasons to keep going to war. So Russia pulled out of the war. It wasn't doing very well in the war anyways. For example, the Battle of Tannenberg from 1914 saw the Russian 2nd Army routed by German 8th Army, a defeat from which they will never recover. German casualties at Tannenberg are 13,873. Russian casualties are 17,000. People died in that battle. Still, the kick of the war was the Battle of the 5 Frontiers from August to September 1914, a series of 5 bloody battles in Lorraine, Ardennes, and southern Belgium. These early exchanges saw the French Plan 17 and German Schlieffen Plan collide. The offensive was a spectacular failure for the French army, with 300,000 casualties. The Battle of Marne from September 1914 initiated trench warfare. It brought an end to the first mobile phase of the war. After a communication breakdown, Helmut von Moltke, the younger's army, dug in at the river Ast. At the Masurian Lakes, September 1914, Russian casualties numbered 125,000 to Germany's 40,000. It was the second catastrophically heavy defeat for the Russian forces. They were outnumbered 3-1 and routed as they tried to retreat. The Battle of Verdun lasted from February to December 1916. It was the longest battle of the war, lasting over 300 days. That battle put such a strain on French forces that the British were pushed to launch the Somme offensive. French infantrymen described the German artillery bombing with these words: "Men were squashed, cut in two, or divided top to bottom, blown into showers, bellies turned inside out." On the eve of the Battle of the Somme, cameraman Geoffrey Mellons visited the front lines, and you can find the footage he shot there on YouTube. is too much for this video. The Gallipoli campaign lasted since April 1915 until January 1916. It was a huge, costly failure for the Allies. The landing of Anzac Cove. Anzac came from Australian New Zealand Army Corps Cove. It was a beach that they were supposed to land on and protect. 3,000 people died on that beach on the attempted landing. They finally landed there, but the campaign was finally a failure. 27,000 French troops became casualties and 150,000 British troops and the Minion ones became casualties. Battle of the Somme lasted from March to July 1918 and was the bloodiest battle of the war. Over 1 million soldiers died there, 460,000 soldiers from the British side, 200,000 from the French side, 100,000 from the German side. Britain was at first the biggest loser, losing in the first day 60,000 soldiers. The Spring Offensive started in March and lasted until July 1918. It saw German stormtroopers make huge advances into France. Having defeated Russia, Germany moved vast numbers of troops to the Western Front. However, this fast pace moving was too fast for the supply chain. They were conquering more than they could afford. Unfortunately for them, they could not keep up with the rate of advance. The 100 Days Offensive started in August, ended in November 1918. It was a rapid series of Allied victories. Beginning at the Battle of Amiens, the German forces were gradually expelled from France and then back past the Hindenburg Line. Widespread German surrender led to armistice in November of the same year. The War at Sea. The first naval battle at sea of World War I happened in August 1914. It was the Battle of Heligoland Bight. The British fleet ambushed and sunk 3 German light cruisers and 1 destroyer. This was one of the few victories of the British forces over the German forces on sea. Even though Britain had more destroyer, more cruisers, despite that they didn't have one thing the Germans had, the U-boats. In 1914, SM U-9 German U-boats sank 3 British armed cruisers in under an hour. U-boats were so effective that they tossed caution to the wind, and on May 7th, 1915, the cruise ship Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat. 1,198 people were killed, including 128 Americans. The recklessness of German submarine warfare was a big influence on the United States' decision to join the Allies in 1917. The carnage at sea didn't end there. From 1916 to 1917, 1.5 million tons of Allied shipping was lost to German U-boats, and Germany didn't even have that many U-boats. Only 360 were constructed, of which 117 were lost. Not misplaced, lost in war. Still, around 50% of British merchant vessels were sunk by German U-boats. While the first military submarine, named the Turtle, was first used by the Continental Army during the American Revolution, submarines only made a large military impact during World War I when Germany launched its fleet of U-boats. Its submarines mostly stayed on the surface and submerged only to attack ships with torpedoes. Germany's indiscriminate submarine warfare was a primary reason that the US joined the war. The largest sea battle of the war was the Battle of Jutland. It lasted since 31 of May until the 1st of June 1916. It was the largest full frontal naval battle of the war. 14 British ships were lost to 11 German ships. Britain lost almost twice as many sailors as Germany. Still, this victory wasn't big enough for Germany to make any difference. They would have needed a better win. The North Sea was heavily mined by both sides. Even though after a 1907 treaty they were not allowed to do that, they could only mine 3 miles of an enemy's coastline, but both sides ignored this rule. The success of German U-boats caused the disastrous Passchendaele offensive. A main reason why this campaign was launched was to capture the German U-boats based at Flanders. The attack failed, however, with Britain suffering massive casualties. Still devastatingly effective and winning the war was the Allied naval blockade of Germany that lasted since August 1914 and ended in January 1919. Germany was becoming more and more reliant on imports for food and bullets, and according to a study, in this blockade were lost almost 500,000 lives. In December 1914, the German Navy bombarded Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby. 18 civilians were killed, and as this poster suggests, the incident created outrage in Britain and was used for later propaganda, this being the other mistake of infuriating the public opinion and getting a country to declare war on you. Finally, there was an estimated 1,547 miles or 2,500 kilometers of trench lines dug during World War I. The trench network stretched approximately 25 60,000 miles or 40,000 kilometers from the English Channel to Switzerland, and the area was known as the Western Front. Casualties. The next section isn't as cheerful as, I don't know, nothing was really cheerful in this video, despite my cat joke. It's a really grim viewing or listening, but the war was grim. Total casualties caused directly by the war are estimated at 37.5 million. 7 million soldiers were maimed for life. Germany, of all countries, lost the most men. 2 million people were killed or missing. Almost 1 million British or British Empire soldiers died. On average, 230 soldiers perished for every hour of fighting. 80,000 British soldiers suffered shell shock, around 2% of the ones that went to war. Shell shock is a mental illness. It leaves you maimed for life. It's believed to be brought on by intense sustained artillery shelling. It cost the Allies $36,000 to kill an opposing serviceman, almost twice as expensive than it cost the Central Powers to kill a man. The highest casualty rate among any country was Australia's. 65% of soldiers died, and France lost the greatest percentage of population. 11% of France's entire population was killed or wounded. On the Western Front, total casualties were 3.5 million dead, almost 8 million wounded. Finally, the Allies lost over 2 million people and 5 million wounded. Central Powers 2.5 million, almost 3 million wounded. All these numbers weren't counting civilians. Battlefield weaponry. At the beginning of the war, people weren't really ready for the war. Many people in Europe joined World War I as an opportunity to leave home, find better places, travel, leave poverty behind. War was seen by many as a vacation destination to be ended in about 6 months. Knowing that, battlefield weaponry wasn't that great to begin at the start of the war. Weaponry was poor protective gear as well. At the beginning of the war, soldiers on all sides were issued with soft hats, no head protective gear at all. Soldiers' uniforms and equipment in 1914 did not match the demands of modern warfare. Later in the war, soldiers were issued with hard hats, steel helmets to protect against artillery fire. Artillery fire was a new concept. Before machine guns, they had infantry which shot one single shot. Artillery fire started having 600 rounds a minute. A simple rifle would have shot 1, 2 or 3 bullets in the same time. At no range, the rate of fire of a single machine gun was estimated as much as 200 rifles. Their awesome defensive capability was a major cause of trench warfare. War is ruthless. In August 1914, German troops shot and killed 150 civilians at airshot. The killing was part of a war policy known as Schrecklichkeit, frightfulness. Its purpose was to terrify civilians in occupied areas so that they would not rebel. Germany was the first to use the flamethrowers at Melancourt in February 26, 1915. These flamethrowers could fire jets of flame as far as 40 meters. Artillery was fast growing in popularity and infantry was losing. In 1914-1915, it's estimated that 50 people were casualties to artillery, while infantry made 22 victims. By the end of the war, in 1917-1918, artillery killed 85 people to each 6 killed by infantry. Artillery proved the #1 threat to infantry and tanks alike. Also, the post-war psychological impact of artillery fire was massive. Called shell shock, it was caused by exploding bombs and artillery fire. As discussed in the previous episode, artillery had the capability of cutting people in half, shredding bodies. During World War I, dogs were used as messengers and carried orders to the front lines in capsules attached to their bodies. Dogs were also used to lay down telegraph lines. By the show of today's quality in infrastructure, I believe we are still using dogs. Russia mobilized 12 million troops during World War I, making it the largest army in the war. More than 3/4 were killed, wounded, or went missing in action. At the end of the war, Russia had suffered heavy losses, with an estimated 2.5 million fatalities. Tanks first appeared on the battlefield at the Somme on 15 September 1916. They were originally called land ships. The name tank was used by the Brits to disguise the production process and lines from enemy suspicion. In 1917, explosive blowing up beneath German lines in Belgium could be heard 220 kilometers away in London. Building mines through no man's land, the name of the land between trenches, was a tactic used before a number of major assaults. Gas attacks became a thing. Approximately 1.2 million soldiers became casualties of gas attacks. Throughout the war, Germans used approximately 70 tons of gas. British and French forces combined 50 tons. Not so many people died, only 3% of war's casualties are because of gas attacks, but they had an incredible capability of maiming people. Dead or not, they were unusable on the battlefield. World War I was the first major war where airplanes were used at any scale. Around 70 different types of planes were used, mainly to spy or to plan ahead. Plane technology progressed, fighter planes were developed, and later on bombers as well. On 8 August 1918 at Amiens, 72 Whippet tanks helped make an advance of 7 miles in one day. General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. The term dogfight originated during World War I. The pilot had to turn off the plane's engine occasionally so it would not stall when the plane turned sharply in the air. When a pilot restarted the engine in mid-air, it sounded like dogs barking. World War I brought a new era of warfare, the most significant development being air power, which unfortunately brought civilians in the line of fire. The introduction of poisonous gas revealed the fact that cavalry was ancient. It was clear that the days of the cavalry as a realistic fighting force were over, and tanks herald a new era of warfare. Finally, the Nazi blitzkrieg tactic of World War II grew out of the final Allied offensive of 1918, in which tanks, aircraft, artillery, and men were carefully coordinated. Mustard gas was really unpredictable. It never became the war-winning weapon as both forces hoped. In World War II, nobody used it. From the 1.2 million affected by poisonous gas, less than 100,000 people died. Most were just maimed for life. Poisonous gas sounds like a thing coming from Germany, but France was the first to use it. In August 1914, France fired the first tear gas grenades against the Germans. In January 1915, Germany first used tear gas against Russian armies, but the gas turned to liquid in the cold air. In April 1915, the Germans were the first to use poisonous chlorine gas. During World War I, over 30 different poisonous gases were used. Soldiers were given canned food, lots of beans in the mix. Nothing good could have come out of that. Also, soldiers were told to hold urine-soaked cloths over their faces and noses and mouths if a gas attack was to suddenly surprise them. As a backup method, anything was better than nothing. By 1918, gas masks with filter respirators usually provided effective protection. At the end of the war, many countries signed treaties outlawing chemical weapons. During World War I, British tanks were categorized as male and female. Male tanks had long cannons, female had heavy machine guns. Continuing with the phallic images, Little Willie was the name of the first tank used by the Brits. Built in 1915, it carried a crew of 3 and could travel as fast as 5 kilometers per hour, or around 3 miles per hour. The Pool of Peace is a 12-meter deep lake near Messines, Belgium. It fills a crater made in 1914 when the Brits detonated a mine containing 45 tons of explosives. One thing to show off, the Germans invented Big Bertha. It was a 48-ton howitzer used by them in the First World War, named after the wife of its designer, Gustav Krupp. It could fire a 1-ton shell at a distance of 15 kilometers. It also wasn't the war-winning weapon they were hoping. It took a crew of over 200 men to assemble a single howitzer. It took them 6 hours, and they only constructed 13 of these huge, massive, enormous weapons. For the span of World War I, from 1914 to 1918, the German forces constructed 274 U-boats. These U-boats sank 6,596 ships. The 5 most successful U-boats were U-35, sinking 224 ships, U-39 sinking 154 ships, U-38 sinking 137 ships, U-34 with 121, and U-33 with 84 ships. Most of these sank near the coast, particularly in the English Channel. Germany was prepared for a long war. Still, mutiny kind of destroyed the ending, and this is seen even in the trenches design. More so if you compare German trenches with British trenches. The German were built to last and included bunk beds, water tanks with faucets, electric lights, doorbells on the doors, furniture, cupboards, and soccer fields. The French had what German soldiers called the Devil gun. At 75mm, this cannon was accurate up to 6 kilometers. The French military commanders claimed that its Devil gun won the war. World War I introduced the widespread use of the machine gun, a weapon Hiram Maxim patented in the US in 1884. The Maxim weighed about 100 pounds. It was water-cooled. It could fire around 600 rounds per minute. Most machine guns used in World War I were based on this Maxim design. And finally, while today we have internet and sharing buttons, almost 500,000 pigeons were used in sharing messages. They were carrier pigeons, and of course you're gonna ask yourself, how could they know where to go if they haven't been there already? Would you just send them in random places? No. Pigeons, trained to go home, were dropped into occupied areas by parachutes and kept there until soldiers had messages to send back home to the source of the pigeon. They were used to carry messages between headquarters and the front lines. Millions of people died in World War I. Tens of millions were involved, the life of hundreds of millions was changed, and the billions that live today live in a different world made by World War I. Still, individuals fought in the war, a lot of them with millions dead, a lot maimed or missing, unsung heroes, or saluted ones but still dead. People had a lot of great stories, and today we're going to see a few of them. Australian Private Billy Singh sniped at least 150 Turkish soldiers at Gallipoli, and he got the nickname Murderer. Today Australians visit Turkey and Turkish people visit Australia. Living in peacetime makes wartime decisions and what made a hero look really strange. For example, US Sergeant Alvin York was the most decorated American soldier. In the Meuse-Argonne offensive of 1918, he led an attack on a machine gun nest, killed 20 enemies, and captured 132. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Many weapons were also captured. During a patrol over Italy in March 1918, Lieutenant Alan Girard's Sopwith camel was hit 160 times. Still, he won. The youngest recipient of the Victoria Cross was a boy, John Cornwall, only 16 years old. He stayed at his post for over an hour despite receiving a fatal wound. There are heroes on all sides. Richthofen remains perhaps the most widely known fighter pilot of all time. He was the most successful fighter pilot of the entire war. He fought on the German side, and Manfred Albrecht Freier von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, shot down 80 planes, more than any other World War I pilot. Unfortunately, he died after being shot down near Amiens. Francis René Fonck was the Allies' most successful fighter pilot, shooting down 75 enemy planes, but he doesn't have a movie made after him, not even a comedy. French Second Lieutenant Alfred Joubert wrote in his diary about World War I just before he died that humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it's doing. What a massacre. What scenes of horror and carnage. I cannot find words to translate my impressions. Hell cannot be so terrible. Men are mad. During World War I, 634 Victoria Crosses were awarded. 166 of those were awarded posthumously. Herbert Hoover, who will become president in 1929, was appointed US Food Administrator. His job was to provide food to the US Army and its allies. To do so, he encouraged people to plant victory gardens or personal gardens. More than 20 million Americans planted their own gardens, and food consumption in the US decreased by 15%. British author T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, worked for Allied intelligence in the Middle East. He also led an Arab uprising against the Turks and wrote about it in his book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Hello girls, as American soldiers called them, were American women who served as telephone operators for Pershing's forces in Europe. The women were fluent in French and English and were specially trained by the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T. Only in 1979, the US Army finally gave war medals and veteran benefits to the few Hello girls that were still alive. Millions of soldiers suffered shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder due to the horrors of trench warfare. Shell-shocked men often had uncontrollable diarrhea, stopped speaking, couldn't sleep, twitched, and whimpered for hours. While some soldiers did recover, others suffered for the rest of their lives. Edith Cavell was a British nurse who helped 200 Allied soldiers escape from German-occupied Belgium. The Germans arrested her and she was executed by a German fire squad. Her death wasn't in vain, it helped turn global opinion against Germany. That was accentuated by the fact that Edith Cavell saved soldiers on all sides. Aníbal Meis was the most decorated Portuguese soldier of the war. He single-handedly withstood 2 German assaults. With his resistance and rate of fire during a German ambush, he convinced the enemy that they were fighting up against a fortified unit rather than one single soldier. 1914's Christmas Eve is famous and will forever be. Soldiers on both sides of the Western Front sang carols to each other, and on Christmas Day troops along 2/3 of the front declared a truce. In some places the truce lasted a week. A year later, sentries on both sides were ordered to shoot down anybody that would try the same thing. The performance wasn't to be repeated, even though soldiers wanted to. Margaret Zale, also known as Mata Hari, was a Dutch exotic dancer accused of being a double agent. Though she always denied being a spy, in 1917 she was executed by the French. The most decorated American of World War I, Alvin Callum York, after leading the successful attack, killing a lot of people and capturing many more, returned home with a Medal of Honor, a promotion to sergeant, the French Croix de Guerre, and a gift of 400 acres of good farmland. On the other hand, the Black Rattlers, or Men of Bronze, famously known as the Harlem Hellfighters, were one of the few African-American units that saw the front lines. For their extraordinary acts of heroism, they received the French Croix de Guerre, a medal awarded to soldiers from Allied countries for bravery in combat. However, in the US their deeds were ignored. They didn't get 400 acres of good farmland. The first battle fought by the US troops was on November 2nd, 1917, in the trenches at Belmont, France, long after the war have seen its greatest loss of life. During the Battle of Somme, the British Army saw its greatest single loss of life in history when its army suffered 60,000 casualties in one day. More British men were killed in that one World War I battle than the US lost from all its armed forces and the National Guard combined. A renegade pilot, Frank Luke, the balloon buster, claimed 18 victories in total. On September 19, 1918, he downed 3 balloons but was fatally injured in the process. Ernst Judith was Germany's second greatest flying ace, claiming 61 victories. He would enjoy a playboy lifestyle after the war. However, he re-enlisted in World War II and committed suicide in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. There were also decorated animals in the war. A pigeon named Cher Ami was awarded the Croix de Guerre avec Palme for her assistance in saving 194 American soldiers trapped behind German lines in 1918. She made it back to her loft despite being shot through the breast, blinded in one eye, covered in blood, and with a leg hanging only by a tendon. Fortunately, the pigeon wasn't eaten. In Britain, killing, wounding, or teasing a homing pigeon was punishable with 6 months imprisonment. This came into force after the Defense of the Realm Act in 1916. A lot of horses were used in World War I. Approximately 8 million of them died. Because so many horses were enlisted, Lizzie the elephant was used to cart munition in Sheffield. Sergeant Stubby, a Boston Bull Terrier, was the most decorated dog of the war and the only one to become sergeant. Stubby was very useful for detecting incoming shellfire, hearing it before humans could. On the first day of the Battle of Verdun, 7,000 horses were killed by shelling, and roughly 1 million dogs died in the war. Dogs were used for sniffing out enemies, carrying supplies, delivering messages, finding the wounded, carrying telegraph lines, and companionship. There were also cats on the front. Peter the cat served at the front from 1914 to 1918, cats and dogs often being used as mascots for frontline troops. There were also people that didn't want to fight in the war. Not many. There were 16,000 British conscientious objectors who refused to fight. Some were given non-fighting roles in the war, others were imprisoned. Speaking of being imprisoned, 30 British soldiers didn't like the thought of that. 29 British officers in July 1918, having spent 10 months constructing the tunnel right under the noses of their German captors, attempted an incredible escape. 10 of these officers made the journey to neutral Holland and returned to England as heroes. Only 6 months after the first deployment of tanks on the front line, tanks became available in stores as toys. The female mortality rate rose in Germany from 14.3 in 1,000 people in 1913 to 21.6 in 1,000 by the end of the war. The biggest rise of any involved countries because of hunger. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died from malnutrition, not directly because they didn't have what to eat, usually from typhus or a disease their weakened body couldn't resist. Starvation was rarely causing death. In both Britain and France, women accounted for around 37% of the industry workforce by the end of the war. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was known as the turnip winter in Germany. That vegetable was usually fed to livestock, but people had to use it as a substitute for potatoes or meat, which were increasingly scarce. Blowing up 8 million horses surely didn't help. By late 1916, the German meat ratio was only 30% of that of peacetime, and it fell to 12% in late 1918. The food supply increasingly focused on potatoes or bread, becoming harder and harder to buy meat. Still, the war had to end and people had to go home. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the war. For example, when soldiers returned, there was a baby boom all around the world. Births increased by almost 15% between 1918 and 1920. During World War I, people of German heritage were suspect in the US. Some protests against Germans were violent, including the burning of German books, the killing of German shepherd dogs, and even the murder of one German American. Americans went so far to change food names. American hamburgers, named after the German city of Hamburg, were renamed Salisbury steak. Frankfurters, which were named after Frankfurt, Germany, were called Liberty sausages. German language books were burned and schools stopped teaching German. The armistice on the Western Front was signed on 1918 at 11 a.m. They loved so much that magic date that another year of war would have been acceptable. The armistice was signed in a train carriage in Compiègne, and when Germany defeated France on 22 June 1940, Adolf Hitler insisted that the armistice was signed in exactly the same carriage. Over the course of the war, 700,000 women took up posts in the munition industry. With many men going to the front, there was a labor shortage, many women filling vacant positions. In 1917, anti-German sentiment forced George V to change the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor. Many road names in Britain were changed as well. More people died of the Spanish flu in a single year than in 4 years of the bubonic plague from 1347 to 1351. And during World War II, the Spanish flu caused about a third of total military deaths. Even though the US government didn't grant Native American citizenship until 1924, nearly 13,000 of them served in World War I, and they were of great use. The Germans were skilled at intercepting and solving Allied codes. They also captured 1 out of 4 paper messengers. However, when a US commander used Choctaw tribe members from the Oklahoma National Guard unit, they used an extremely complex language that the Germans could not translate. The 8 Choctaw men and others who joined them become known as the Choctaw Code Talkers. Poppies have become a powerful symbol of remembering fallen soldiers because it's one of the few flowers that grew on decimated battlefields. World War I is the 6th deadliest conflict in world history. The total cost of the war for the US was more than $30 billion. The war left thousands of soldiers disfigured and disabled. Reconstructive surgery was used to repair facial damage, but masks were also used to cover the most horrific disfigurement. Some soldiers stayed in nursing homes their entire lives. 4 empires collapsed at the end of the war: the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian. The collapse of the first, the Ottoman Empire, led to Britain and France taking their colonies in the Middle East as League of Nations mandates. Britain took control of Palestine and Mesopotamia, Iraq, and France took control of Syria Lebanon, and Jordan, among others. World War I was the catalyst that transformed Russia into the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. It was the creation of the world's first communist state and ushered in a new phase in world history. Historians note that this was the most startling and important consequence of World War I. The long-term effects of World War I include the formation of the League of Nations, which led the groundwork for the United Nations and the worldwide arms race. Additionally, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe sanctions on Germany, which drove the country into a deep recession, setting the groundwork for World War II. The First War helped strengthen the power of central government in the United States and Europe, which meant that 19th century liberalism that emphasized individual responsibility was gone forever. In fact, one of the chief legacies of the war is the lasting power of the state over its citizens. World War I also increased people's suspicions of minority groups. All outsiders were considered a potential threat, especially the Jews, who were seen as sleek profiteers of the armaments industry. Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland emerged as independent nations after the war. Also, Britain's leadership in the world economy was gone forever. It had huge debts, high unemployment, and slow growth. France suffered as well. Most of the loans it had made to Tsarist Russia were, of course, never paid by the new government. Inflation was rampant and large parts of the country were ruined. Russia underwent two revolutions. In October 1917, Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party took control. The first revolution in March had led to the creation of the provisional government, but their failure to stop the war brought massive support for the Bolsheviks. Still, World War I helped in some areas. It hastened medical advances. Physicians learned better wound management and the setting of bones. Harold Gillis, an English doctor, pioneered skin graft surgery. The huge scale of those who needed medical care in World War I helped teach physicians and nurses the advantages of specialization and professional management. The war helped bring about the emancipation of African Americans. For example, Henry Ford recruited black people from the South to work in his factories. The migration of African Americans from the South to the North during World War I was one of the most significant population shifts in the 20th century. The war also helped bring about the emancipation of women. They took over many traditionally male jobs and showed that they could perform them just as well as men. In 1918, most women over the age of 30 were given the vote in the British parliamentary elections. 2 years later, the 19th Amendment granted American women the vote. Nearly 2/3 of military deaths in World War I were in battle. In previous conflicts, most deaths were due to disease. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept guilt for the war and pay $31.4 billion in reparations. That's approximately 500 billion in today's money. Germany's army was capped at 100,000 soldiers and its navy at 6 battleships with no air force allowed. Germany's peacetime strength was 761,000 men prior to the war, so this was a significant reduction. Also, Germany lost 30% of its European territory, more than 27,000 square miles, 50,000 kilometers. Many nationalists in Germany called the signatories of the treaty the November criminals and refused to accept they had lost the war. This led to the stab in the back myth. Some nationalists blamed those responsible for signing the Treaty of Versailles, the new Weimar government, and Jews for the defeat of Germany. Germans were not the only people opposing the Treaty of Versailles. French General Ferdinand Foch said this of the Treaty of Versailles: "This is not peace, it's an armistice for 20 years. And he was right. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, he completely disregarded the treaty and used it as an excuse to fulfill expansionist policies. The failure of the signees of the Treaty of Versailles and of the League of Nations to stop him led to World War II 20 years later, after the signing. During World War I, the Turks slaughtered approximately 1.5 million Armenians. This act of genocide would later attract the attention of Hitler and was partly responsible for sowing the seeds of the Holocaust. The United States joined World War I during the final year and a half of fighting. Still, some Americans disagreed with the United States' initial refusal to enter World War I, so they joined the French Foreign Legion or the British or Canadian Army. A group of US pilots formed the Lafayette Escadrille, which was part of the French Air Force and became one of the top fighting units of the Western Front. The war transformed the United States into the largest military power in the world. During the war, the US has shipped about 7.5 million tons of supplies to France to support the Allied effort that included 70,000 horses or mules, 50,000 trucks, 27,000 freight cars and 1,800 locomotives. More than 200,000 African Americans served in World War I, but only about 11% of them were in combat forces. The rest were put in labor units, loading cargo, building roads and digging ditches. They served in segregated divisions, the 92nd and 93rd, and trained separately. During US involvement in the war, more than 75,000 people gave about 7.5 million hour-minutes pro-war speeches in movie theaters and elsewhere to about 315 million people. To increase the size of the US Army during World War I, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which was also known as the conscription or draft, in May 1917. By the end of the war, 2.7 million were drafted, another 1.3 million volunteered. Despite those great numbers, the United States only spent 7.5 months in actual combat, during which time 117 people were killed and 204,000 were wounded. In the Battle of Verdun of 1916, there were over 1 million casualties in just 10 months. By 1918, German citizens were striking and demonstrating against the war. The British Navy blocked German ports, which meant that thousands of Germans were starving and the economy was collapsing. Then the German Navy suffered a major mutiny. After German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November the 9th, 1918, the leaders of both sides met at Compiègne, France, and the peace armistice was signed later on November the 11th. The end of the war and armistice. Although both sides launched renewed offensives in 1918 in an all-or-nothing effort to win the war, both efforts failed. The fighting between exhausted, demoralized troops continued to plod along. In August-September, an Allied offensive along the Meuse River and throughout the Argonne forest succeeded in driving an exhausted German army backward toward the German border. A deadly outbreak of influenza, meanwhile, took heavy tolls on soldiers of both sides. Eventually, the government of both Germany and Austria-Hungary began to lose control as both countries experienced multiple mutinies from within their military structures. When they signed the armistice on the 11th of November 1918, they agreed to surrender their arms, give up much of their navy, and evacuate occupied territory. The treaty stated that Germany had started World War I, it gave Alsace and Lorraine back to France, Poland picked up German territory in the east, and other territories were given to Belgium and Lithuania. The treaty also transferred the Hulzchin area of Upper Silesia to Czechoslovakia. The eastern part of Upper Silesia was assigned to Poland. Lower Silesia, meanwhile, was left entirely to Germany. The key Baltic port of Gdansk, the industrial region of the Saar Basin, and the strategically important Rhine were also taken from Germany. Its armed forces were strictly limited and its colonies were made League of Nations mandates. A 1921 reparation committee decided that Germany should pay 33 billion in compensation to the Allies for the damage it caused. The treaty left Germany humiliated and impoverished, which left the world vulnerable to another world war. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended World War I just in 1919. Germany had to surrender its African colonies, and the League of Nations was started to prevent future wars. It helped Europe rebuild, and 53 nations joined by 1923. But the US Senate refused to let the United States join the League of Nations, and as a result, President Wilson, who had established the League, suffered a nervous collapse and spent the rest of his term as an invalid. Even Germany joined the League of Nations. It did that in 1926, but many Germans were very resentful of the Treaty of Versailles. Finally, Germany and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. Italy withdrew 3 years later, and the League of Nations was unable to stop the German, Italian, and Japanese from expanding their power and taking over smaller countries. Many believe World War I never really ended, and that World War II never would have happened if not for World War I. During the First War, journalists risked their lives to report on the war. The government tried to control the flow of information from the front line during the war, and journalists were banned from reporting. The War Office considered reporting on the war as helping the enemy, and if journalists were caught, they faced the death penalty. A handful of journalists did risk their lives to report on the war and the harsh realities that the soldiers faced. Around 12 million letters were delivered to the frontline every week. Even during times of war, it took only 2 days for a letter to be delivered from Britain to France. By the time the war ended, over 2 billion letters and 140 million parcels had been delivered to the trenches. Plastic surgery was invented because of World War I. One of the earliest examples of plastic surgery came during World War I, when a surgeon by the name of Harold Gillis helped shrapnel victims with terrible facial injuries. Shrapnel caused many facial injuries in the war, and the twisted metal would inflict far worse injuries than the straight line wounds of a bullet. Dr. Gillis pioneered the early techniques for facial reconstruction. Over 250,000 underage soldiers were allowed to fight in the war. The youngest, a boy Sidney Lewis, was just 12 years old, but lied about his age to join. There were many thousands of underage boys who enlisted, and most lied about their age. Some joined for the love of their country, while others did it to escape from the lives and the poor conditions they lived in. Blood banks were also developed during the war. The routine use of blood transfusion was used to treat wounded soldiers. Blood was transferred directly from one person to another. In 1917, a US Army doctor by the name of Captain Oswald Johnson established the first blood bank on the Western Front. He used sodium citrate to prevent the blood from coagulating and becoming unusable. The blood was kept on ice for as long as 28 days and was transported when needed to casualty clearing stations for use in life-saving surgery on soldiers who had lost a lot of blood. And finally, army generals had to be banned from going over the top. One common stereotype is that ordinary soldiers were used by the higher-ups, lions led by donkeys as the saying goes, the donkeys being the incompetent generals who didn't spend any time on the front line, while thousands of soldiers, the lions, were killed. Actually, so many British generals wanted to fight and they had to be banned from going over the top because they were being killed, and the experience of a general was too important to lose. And that's, in closing, the aftermath of World War I. The creation of USSR and Treaty of Versailles that led to the Second World War might be the most important consequences that we feel to this day. That's all for today. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. I'd like to thank the last 2 persons that subscribed to the channel. I'd like to thank anybody and everybody that watched this episode. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you next time. I'm Alex, and beware of falling apples.